Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're right at the top of the hour, so we'll be getting started here in just a couple minutes. Just want to give a couple extra minutes for anybody else that's a straggler joining us here. So we'll get started here in just a minute. Thank you. While we're waiting, I'll just quickly note out for those that are on the call. Obviously, we're doing this via GoToWebinar. We do have a chat open, so while you guys are muted, you are welcome to ask questions into our chat. We have someone on our side that will be monitoring that and can help kind of reference that for us. So if you have any questions, feel free to ping it out to us, and Chris and I can do our best to try to talk to it during the webinar here. And outside of that, I'd say give it one more minute, and then we will get started. Okay. Well, I think we can. I think we can probably go get started. Obviously, we're going to have this recorded for folks afterwards, so they can always come back and watch it afterwards. So, for those that are on the call, thank you so much for joining us. This is our second webinar in this series, and we're really excited to join you today and to be able to talk a little bit about AWS and the events and metrics that are coming from AWS and how teams use that to monitor their stack. On the call, just like our last webinar, we have myself, so I'm Jason Gucher. I'm head of customer success at ControlStack. We also have Chris Schellenbarger, who is our DevRel leader and also a founder here at ControlStack. So we're really excited to meet up and chat with you guys. Chris, anything you want to say before we jump into it?
No, just thanks everybody for coming. And, as Jason said earlier, if you have questions, you can put them in the client or, stay after or email us directly at the end. We're both available to answer anything. So.
Cool. All right, well then I guess let's get started. So AWS, obviously, I think it's pretty well known. I think a lot of people understand AWS. We can talk to a little bit more, but clearly it's a cloud provider. It allows you to be able to leverage a lot of services that can be connected with one another to run your stack. And it's just one of the cloud providers out there. It's one that we work with a lot, right, Chris?
Yep, and today what we want to talk about in particular is events in AWS. Most people when they start using AWS, they're really used to, the things that are analog in their, old data centers, servers, EC2 instances, storage, and whatnot. And one of the things that I found personally to be, kind of opaque and misunderstood, or actually I didn't even know existed for a long time, was this concept of events in AWS. And, we'll talk a little bit more about how AWS does it, but, just a kind of general overview. So when you're doing, your site reliability, your DevOps processes, a lot of times, you look at the standard data metrics, logs. I feel like those are the ones that are most common. And then there's these things called events. A lot of times you see like log tools that can like turn logs into events or metrics into events as things spike. But in AWS world, they actually have a discrete type, if you will, of events. And so basically those semantically represent something that happened at a given time. So, you get into AWS and things are happening, right? Like your EC2 instances are starting and they're stopping. People are reading and writing from your S3, from your Dynamo tables, and people are making changes, right? To via API calls, command line, console access, all these things. So, what we're talking about today is these things that AWS, basically data. Every time something changes in the AWS system, in your AWS account, an event is fired. And we'll talk more about that. And you can also, you have your own applications. When people sign up, people cancel. These are events that are important to your business. So they all combine into, this big, kind of stream, fire hose of events in AWS.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing, right? It's kind of like mentioned with AWS in any cloud provider. The idea is that there's so many services that connect, and that's kind of like the value prop, right? It's like this ability to have essentially, I think a lot of people start thinking of multi-cloud and being able to have workloads running in multiple areas for disaster recovery style processes. But yeah, it's like connecting all these services. And the problem you get into is like you're talking about from that fire hose is that there's so many events that are tied to all of these different services. And like, how do you make sense of these events as they go one through another, right? Like it could be something like changing the logic of your Lambda function and it impacting iterator age. And it's like those changes are events that are emitted in the system, but sometimes because you have such a fire hose of things, it's hard to make sense of that and find the right pieces of nuggets of information that actually help you get to the answers faster.
Yeah, and especially when you're first starting using AWS, like not even knowing that the events exist, or because sometimes like finding metrics, not many metrics are there, but or your things aren't starting up, or like what's happening in your system, like you don't even know to go look at the tools that are, that at the AWS events that are occurring. So hopefully this will help explain some of that.
I'll tell you, as someone who's a customer success person that doesn't, hadn't really been using AWS heavily myself ahead of time, I wouldn't have even realized like where to go for those events and how to look at them. Like, luckily we had something like Control Stack for me to use here where I could see those AWS events flow in, and it's something that I felt more comfortable with in terms of like the UI and how to move around it. So yeah, definitely there's a lot of value in the events. I would be surprised for somebody who didn't know how to find that correctly and leverage them directly inside of AWS to help answer those questions. So EventBridge, I know that's a bridge that obviously is from AWS that we use internally. We have customers set up to help try to track a lot of the event changes that are going on around their system, right?
Yeah. So EventBridge is the kind of latest service, if you will, serverless service from AWS, where it's basically an event bus, and it used to be called Amazon CloudWatch Events. And it also, it's a little confusing, but there's a CloudTrail that used to be the logs of all the API calls that someone would make or anyone makes against your AWS account. And so CloudTrail just had the API calls, but AWS has since rolled in, EventBridge now contains all the events as well for any API calls, all the CloudTrail events. So basically CloudWatch events, CloudTrail events. It can be very confusing when you first start, but EventBridge is the new service which kind of contains them all. Standard enterprise architecture of event buses, submit events, decouple your systems. Events get fired and different things can be triggered off them without being directly coupled. In EventBridge, some of the things that come out of the box is AWS CloudTrail, like I said, which are all the API calls. So when someone makes any API call with a client or through the console access, like a log or an event is fired and into EventBridge. AWS services, there's a whole list, and each service fires different events. But for example, EC2 fires instance state changes, start, stop, terminate, these types of things. When someone changes your security policies, when someone changes your security groups or your network things, those are all API calls, right? Any command into AWS, that actually alters state gets logged as an event. So, and then also there's a couple things that can happen. You can partner with AWS partners, such as Control Stack. And so these are basically when you're working with external tools and they want to fire events into your system that you would respond to. As well as like your own application code, as I mentioned before, you might want to use EventBridge as your own event bus instead of implementing some sort of partially managed or self-managed solution.
Yeah. it's funny, obviously those that are joining us don't really know necessarily about our background and kind of how we met. But I remember in like our past experiences when we used to work with your old company, there's a lot of talk about the event buses and how those events were coming in and out of the system. I remember lots of those conversations. But yeah,
Yeah, event buses. Oh no, I was gonna say event buses have been around a long time. They've been used differently. They can be intimidating. They can add a layer of complexity, in the decoupling of services, but they also, add value as well to an architecture.
Yeah. I'll tell you, like one thing that really surprised me as we, because obviously we're talking about events, one of the things that really surprised me, and I'll make sure that our marketing team adds it out for those that we're sending this recording to after the fact. I'll make sure we have them add a link to this article that I wrote, I want to say a few months back. But like, this was like a good experience for myself, and I won't go into too much detail of like what this is, but you have so many events that AWS is emitting at all times. And like there's sometimes when you don't even necessarily know that that event is there and that it's something that's built into like the AWS logic. And like, for example, in this case, like I was working with a past design partner and we would spin up these new GPU instances, but unfortunately we were trying to like allocate them into their stack during peak times, and because there just wasn't a lot of capacity for those GPU instances, they would hit capacity and just would have insufficient capacity. But that's not, and if that's the error we got, like that would be okay. I could use that as an event and help like answer those questions. But that's not the event that we were getting. We were getting this event of your vCPU limit is reached, like you're maxed out. I couldn't figure it out, but it's like as we started digging in and like using control stack to understand those events, we actually found under the hood that AWS, we were making the request, they were attempting to it, hitting insufficient capacity, but retrying it immediately. We didn't know that retry logic. And that retry logic was not resetting the limit that we had already hit. So it was telling us like we were hitting this limit even though we weren't. Right. So like you definitely have it's not like just having the events off just straight from the fire hose like helps answer the questions. Like sometimes you really need something that can like dig into these a little bit more detail to understand really how they're connected. Because I mean in that case, oh, I think me and one of the backend engineers probably spent 2 or 3 hours digging into it until we realized like, oh no, this was this was not a CPU limit issue at all. It was insufficient capacity.
Yep, and that's exactly it. First it's like knowing that Amazon has events, and then once you look at it and there's just a lot of them, and deriving meaning and like what that actually means to your stack is a whole other level that's different for almost every service, every use case. So we'll talk about that, and ways for managing that and improving that a little bit in a couple minutes here. So
yeah,
let's see what we got next.
Yeah, let's move on here. So AWS events, the things that are actually flowing into the event bridge. I think we kind of talked about this a little bit, yeah.
Yep, but the thing we talked about the left-hand side here.
Right.
So all these API calls, service events, your own events, and partner events. But where do those go? They go to EventBridge, and that's like this nebulous serverless service. But I feel like I'm not sure if it's been updated in AWS, but you actually have to go in and like tell it to log somewhere because they happen, and if you don't send them to logs, they'll kind of just be lost if no one's listening. And and the reason they make you do it is probably because it costs money to store logs as they accumulate. So, one of the easiest ways when you're getting used to, my journey was I found out these events on EventBridge. I wanted to see them. There's in the UI, the console for AWS, you can enable just a log to a CloudWatch log stream, and then you can go there. And then, we have a screenshot a little later, but there's a lot of them. You just instantly find out it's too much, right? Within seconds, you see it's logging hundreds per second.
Yeah.
And this is where Jason was talking about like the fire hose. You just, imagine those arrows or flows of copious amounts of water. You have other Amazon event bridges that hook into it, or event buses, and then you can send to other event bridges, and you can send to HTTP endpoints as well. So like kind of like the pattern of webhooks, you can take events and filter them just like any other event bus, transform other logic, and send to a HTTP endpoint. or send to monitoring tools or view via monitoring tools, which we'll talk about a little bit more here in a minute.
Well, speaking of, so this is kind of off the cuff, so hopefully I'm not throwing you too much of a curveball here, Chris. But like when we talk about AWS events and we talk about like the data atoms that help you kind of like dig into these issues, right? What does AWS do to like make it easy to combine events with like their CloudWatch metrics, and like do they give a good visualization of like how those things connect inside of AWS console directly?
So I'd say like, this is another example of, AWS does a really good job of giving you kind of like the very base granular tools, a lot of data. They don't necessarily make it, easy to reason about, easy to connect things. And so when you look at, for example, CloudTrail events, a lot of times they're just AWS API call happened, and they'll give you, some sort of, usually like the ARNs to identify like what was affected sometimes not. And yeah, so no, you basically just get a JSON blob, and you have to figure out, like, so you have to copy, if you're logging through going through the logs and you find a instance ID, you have to take that and copy it into the EC2 console just to see like that instance. It's very hard to reconstruct context of that event without piecing together. That's the kind of the AWS console. You're constantly, you're at EC2, then that's talking to your RDS. So you've got to have a different tab open for everything versus seeing, getting the whole context in a view. That's one thing where the AWS console isn't designed to do, and they just don't try because they don't need to, right? There's other tools that try to do this.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. Is like I wonder if it really is just because AWS is focused on delivering new services and new functionality, and if the product works as it is today, they probably just know that there are other vendors in the space to fill that last 15-20% gap while they can focus on the new services that they launch. Probably way more important to them for their growth.
Yeah, and if you see like one of the things they've done recently, I can't remember what AWS is, it's like Service Map or something like this, but they tried to like make a little bit better visualization for things that run in a VPC, like instances and subnets and such. But there's still like this gap, like to your original question of like, from events to these resources, right? So, let's say even if you could just like go through all the events for your EC2 instances, there's no connection visually directly, or even a link that would like you could click that take you to an instance and then quickly iterate through the different instances. Nothing like that I've seen within AWS myself.
Yeah, it's a tough problem. It's a tough problem, but I mean, there's obviously vendors in the space to help, right? So yeah, clearly just the literal fire hose of events. It's a lot to try to process through. I know I've seen a lot of things when it comes to like scaling of nodes, and a lot of things that we've tested with like ECS have had a lot of events that come from it, and it's very, very noisy to make sense out of.
Yeah, people just don't. I mean, as soon as you turn on, anyone here that goes and turns on, events and logs into the, your default log and you look in there, it's just, you give up very quickly because there's just too much. There's, yeah, exactly. So,
like this, yeah.
In here within the minute, this is just the CloudTrail events, right? So this is just the API calls that happen within an AWS account that we have, right? And so you can just see it's just the query start. There's all these things. If you have a very small cluster that's like maybe a home lab or something like this, you might be able to reason over it. But, for any kind of org supporting multiple teams, multiple services, multiple people doing work, especially if you've got your org blended, if you have different VPCs, different resources for your different environments, people working, like you're just going to have this. It's, in one hand, it's good because you have a lot of visibility, but to try to manually make sense of any of this stuff is, you're not going to find it very easy or, yielding answers that are valuable to you.
Yeah, I tell you, obviously we looked at this deck ahead of time, make sure we're on the same page. I didn't even realize that this was less than a minute's worth of events that we were looking at. I was looking for the bottoms of the top. I was like, oh wow, that really is like less than a minute. It's like 30 seconds worth of events just right there. So you start adding that up throughout a day. Yeah, I can understand how it just gets very, very noisy.
Yeah, and then you combine that with the state changes, because like what happens is these are API calls, and then API calls can lead to events being triggered. For example, you could start an instance or restart it, and it might there's events for like state change. It goes from pending to running to stop to, those types of things. So each of these API calls can lead to a little, especially if you take down like a EKS cluster. Yeah. So here's actually,
Wow.
when you go and enable event bus, and maybe I didn't actually specify this. So when you enable event, you go to EventBridge, there's something called the default event bus. This is where AWS sends the CloudTrail events as well as the, your system events for all the different services that run in AWS. And as you can see here, it's just structured JSON, right? These are just JSON blobs. And you can do structured search if you know what you're looking for, but like Jason was saying earlier, what do the arms mean? What do those things mean? So unless you're very specifically looking for an arm, which usually you're not, because sometimes those arms are changing, especially instances.
Yeah.
EKS as pods and nodes are going up and down. Like, I mean, this is even more like this is all within.
It's very hard to do that for things that are changing dynamically a lot.
Yeah, and if you look at the timestamps here, right, this is all just within, I believe, within 1 to 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Right. So if you look at the granularity, the other one was within 1 minute, and now you're actually looking at the actual events on the bus. And we don't log many application events here. So these are just AWS internal events. And so grokking over that is something that, it's hard, one, for this, and then two, for combining the context that, about what's actually happening in your system.
Yeah, it's a thing that I think kind of drove us in the way that we built ControlSec and why we were building ControlSec, right? Like what we saw in the past, which is just, you have so much data and so much out there that you can use to solve problems, but teams really only use like 10% of what they have, maybe, because they just aren't aware that that data is there, that those data points that help tell the problem or tell the story are even available to use. You don't know how to access them. You just get inundated. I think this is just a really good example of it, because I think logs are a great way to be able to tell what's happening in your system. Just they have their place just as events and metrics do. But when you have something like this, where you have this many log entries in a 1 to 2 second span, it's just, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, I mean, as a user, right? I created an EC2 instance, and it like can't access things, right? I'd like to be able to go in and just be like, where's my instance? Specifically just what I'm dealing with. But AWS makes that hard, because you have to know piece of the context. I have to know my instance ID. I have to know kind of the resources I'm accessing, and then use that to search these logs. Versus, something like ControlStack, which actually kind of unifies that context for you, and then makes it actually, point and click for discovery here. So,
yeah,
and that's where we kind of lead into ControlStack here, and monitoring tools.
Yeah. So exactly right. There's the gap that is missing right now with AWS. Oh, we love AWS. We love it. We love the providers that we work with. They do provide a lot of great information, but that's where we kind of come in, is to help filter through all of those events, filter through all of those metrics, and not just in AWS, like tying across all of your technology stack, right? There's obviously software and SaaS tools that you use that are deployed on AWS, and sometimes you have to be able to tell those relationships too. Like that's ultimately like the main thing you have to know, right? When you're troubleshooting, you need to be able to know how all of that stuff works together, not just the AWS stuff. So it's not even just how do I sift through AWS, it's how do I then combine it with everything else I have and sift through all of that to find, kind of that needle in the haystack.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is like we said earlier, AWS isn't trying to give you the tools to like do robust monitoring. They're trying to give you all the information so that tools, whether you build them yourself in-house or you use a third-party person, can be built on top to like solve specific problems. And so in our case, unifying context around the system, as well as kind of giving you, a way to actually handle the fire hose of events.
Yes. So I think that might be a good segue to kind of go into ControlStack. You good with that, Chris?
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, cool. Well, for everybody that's on the call, I want to show you, as we said, right, there's there's that gap, right, of how do I process through everything? And control stack definitely fits in for that need. And I've seen it myself because I've engaged with the product and platform for some time now and have a much better understanding of how AWS works because of control stack. Without this, I'm probably months behind the curve here, right? In this case, what we're looking at right now is our event flow. So all of the events that flow into system across the different technologies you use in your stack. So you can see stream lanes for GitLab, for AWS in our case, because we're focused on AWS today. You can see that we give you that quick way to be able to look at those events as they're flowing in and filter and, kind of dive through everything that you have sending in a meaningful way to be able to filter out the noise and get to what you want. So like in this case, we're looking at it over time. We can filter based on errors and warnings that are seen. In this case, luckily, we don't have any today. Maybe we can, if we look back at the last 12 hours, maybe there might be some. We can take a look and see if something populates here. But ultimately, yeah, there's so many events that can come into the system and things that are changing over time. Maybe we're not having anything for 12 hours. We'll go look at 2 hours here. And again, we're still filtering on EventBridge here. So yeah, no drastic changes or warnings. So that's a positive for us. But again, like I've always felt that you need to find a way to combine events with the metrics that you're looking at and the other tech stacks. And my biggest gap I know in our kind of past lives that we used to work is that we'd have metrics observability that would help us see what's going on with our system, but I could not reason with those metrics. I could not visually identify what the architecture actually looked like and how the things related with one another. It was just a very hard thing for me to do. Control stack has made it pretty easy to do that. And I've built out a few scenes I think that can kind of illustrate that. So I'll walk through that a little bit for everybody that's on the call. So as I mentioned, AWS, there's a lot of different services, right? You have ECS, you have Cognito, S3, X-Ray, DynamoDB, Kinesis, Lambdas. Like, there's just so many different services you could use. And the question is that if you're using them, how do you combine them together to be able to kind of give you that simplified view of what's happening in your system? In this case, what we're looking at right now is like one aspect of that, where perhaps I'm running Kubernetes in AWS directly, maybe I'm running it in like EKS, which is what we're looking at here. In this case, this scene I took probably about 30 to 45 seconds to create. And ultimately what we're looking at here is the specific namespaces that we care about inside of our EKS cluster. We can see the pods that are tied to that namespace, but I can also go deeper and look at the actual infrastructure it's running on, right? I can actually come in here and say, well, in this case, I want to look at our processor's namespace. I can immediately see a dynamically changing architecture that shows me the new cloud instances that are tied to that EKS node group. I can see the nodes and what the health of those nodes are directly here in the system. So I don't have to start from a standpoint of a metrics chart and then I have to find the context. Like I can visually see the context and then build that into my knowledge of the metrics itself, which I think was huge for my learning.
Yeah, and one thing to add here too, that I think is very helpful is that you're showing pods at the bottom there and cloud instances and namespaces. So what you're actually doing is combining, the concepts from Kubernetes and AWS into a singular view. Whereas, with other tools I've used in the past, it's a combination of using a tool for Kubernetes and a tool for AWS, usually like the console or the command line. And I'm jumping between the two. I'm looking at like, what are my nodes in Kubernetes? Oh, I got my instance ID, and I go to AWS. It's all here for you. You can, so if your pods are not loading or not scheduling, your nodes aren't functioning, the nodes are right there. Those are, tied to, they're nested in a cloud instance, right? You can see your logs. Basically you're trying to unify this context so you're not jumping around, copying and pasting, and that context that you have in your head that you used to use to stitch all the websites and tools together is, that's what this, this is, trying to, and I think does to a pretty reasonable extent.
It's so funny. I remember some old ops people that I used to work with maybe 8 or 9 years ago when they would do upgrades and it would be like 9 or 10 different terminals opened up on their screen that they were constantly making changes from. And it's like, that's what I picture when you say that is this idea of I've got 2 terminals up where I'm looking at AWS and using like EKS cuddle in one spot, and then I'm over here doing kube cuddle in the other to describe my pods and understand these crash loops that I'm running into. It's very hard to try and do that context switch back and forth and still be able to build that mental model, where I found Control Stack definitely helped kind of piece it together. But we obviously, and I think our last webinar was really focused on Kubernetes, but I do find, like, when we get into demos, a lot of times we have potential customers look at us and say, well, are you only Kubernetes? And that's definitely not the case. Where we obviously work with a lot of other services as well. For example, like in this case, if you wanted to focus on the health of your DynamoDB tables and you wanted to know what's actually reporting into it and what some of the actual reporting metrics coming from your DB table look like, all of that stuff is very easily built and bookmarked and set for your teams directly inside of Control Stack. These can be dashboards that we provide out of the box for you very easily. It wouldn't be tough. Same thing with Kinesis to Lambda. I know a lot of times we had design partners that have Kinesis streams. They're taking in a fire hose of those data and events from a lot of different sources, and depending on the logic and what information is being received, a lot of them will flow down into Lambdas, or they may flow into S3 buckets or whatever it is. And in our case, in this point, right, I may want to look at all of our streams, but really maybe I only want to look at streams that are flowing into Lambdas, right? It's always about being able to filter the view that you have based on your needs. So in this case, we have other streams I could look at, but only these 3 streams are actually flowing into Lambdas. I can go in here and stream it down to just one of them. If I didn't want to look at all that noise, I can look at all of them in one place. And again, all of that data is readily available. I know iterator age was a huge one for us when you talk about Lambdas, like how long is it actually taking this thing to process through. So obviously in our Lambda functions, we have all of those metrics readily available. So I can come in here and I can look at our iterator age. I can look at our invocations. All this stuff is, a click away. It's all built into it relationally, where I don't have to jump around to find it. I don't have to go from one console page to another and have 20 tabs open to show it. I can see it in one look, which is huge for me.
Yeah, it's really good. And the nice thing is that these views are all, this is something we can help customize for particular stacks, right? So if you've got a different combination of Lambdas and other services, just swap out Kinesis stream for Athena tables or whatever you're working with. That's something that power of a flexible tool like Control Stack is that it's basically designed to support all the AWS services, as well as bespoke infrastructure, as well as your own application concepts. But unifying that context from application to infrastructure to managed services is something that saves a lot of time when you're just looking at the system, onboarding, as well as when you have incidents that you're trying to quickly resolve. These tools all come together in one single tool to help you investigate issues much faster.
Yeah, actually, I didn't even think about showing that here, but what I can do actually real quick, let me come back here and pull up our services dashboard. So this morning I was actually working with a potential customer and made some changes myself in the system about what was happening, and I had gone through and done some scaling actions myself. So for those that are on the call, if you look at Control Stack as like a potential vendor that you want to look at, understand we have full access internally for our demo instance, so I can do a lot of these actions here. You can control that through our RBAC controls, and we can do that through the external role you set up with AWS. So if you don't want to take actions in the system, you don't have to. In my case, I went directly into one of those scenes we were looking at and just did a EKS node group resize. And what ended up happening is it ended up causing a lot of pods to start erroring out as they were being deployed, because there was just not capacity for it. So to your point, it's just like root causing it and understanding the issues. If I get into this place where I see deployment errors spike up, I need to be able to see something that can point back to that resizing, right? Because clearly that is what was the underlying cause for us not being able to actually get those pods put into a node and actually running. So being able to see something like this, where I can come directly into our system and within maybe 20 seconds here, I can immediately see that there were 10 relevant events. I even thought I was confused by this connecting of terminal, and it turned out that I was actually going in and accessing the terminal on these machines. Like it's not necessarily the specific reason, but it could be a potential cause. And control stack can see that relationship and can tell you and alert you to that 10 minutes before the issue you see, there were a lot of connections directly via SSM into those machines. So being able to kind of root
Yeah, and
cause,
if you look at it,
I think it's huge.
if you look at this, this is doing exactly what we were talking about. You have these events that are happening in the system. AWS is just one source of them. And you put them together, and then this is unifying that context. Like that pop-up you just had there, it had, your picture there. It had the instances that were affected, and it made it, digestible.
Yeah.
And I believe if you scroll down to the bottom, there's the infrastructure view. So not only do you have these, right there, you've got events happening, you got logs here. It kind of, this is just a really kind of illustrating, it's affecting the REST deployment in your Kubernetes cluster, right? Like it's all there. And then from there, it doesn't, have 100% of the answers, but it has all the places you can start, right? So like where you used to go to a site, copy something, go to another site, and investigate, these give you a lot of those starting points, but then let you within the tool continue to explore, to discover, investigate, and diagnose.
Yeah,
it's kind of what we really try to do.
Yeah, and it's really made things so much easier for me to understand as somebody who's just not a traditional developer or SRE. It's even made, again, for those that are on the call, you guys will probably understand this. I'm in customer success, but I'm more of a technical customer success. I work very closely with our developers and engineers. So at least I did have some of that knowledge ahead of time, but still, it's very hard to piece together what y'all are doing, because y'all are doing the real work, right? Y'all are the real MVPs, as you would call it. I'm just kind of sitting back. But to that point, Chris, that actually brings up an idea, something that I wanted to showcase. I didn't talk to you about this ahead of time. But what I decided was that I wanted to show you something that I was doing early on at Control Stack that you might have not been aware of, that you might look back and say, wow, I'm glad Jason was doing stuff like that. So for those on the call, Chris is kind of our resident IAM policy guru. He's the one who seems to understand IAM the best. He's dealt with these issues in the past quite a bit. And obviously, as customer success, I'm working with customers a lot. And anybody who's dealt with AWS, especially with IAM policies in particular, knows that IAM policies can go wrong very quickly, and you might be missing the things that you need, and it can send you hours trying to dig into something when really it's just like one small policy update. So in Control Stack, as I was working with some of our early design partners, one of the asks and use cases that we were working on was this concept of spinning up new instances. And I used to have this process where when I would reboot a machine that I recently created, I wanted it to generate a new file and add it into a folder on that machine. So I had like cron jobs set up and everything. And the way I would verify it was that I would go directly into terminal. I'd go into SSM directly in Control Stack, and I would just go jump over to that directory and just see, like, is that file there after reboot? And for you, obviously I know your time is important along with the rest of the engineering team. So I really wanted to try to be self-sufficient about how I kind of dug around AWS. So there would be times when I knew that we had systems in our stack where I could go in and go directly into terminal, right? I knew that I could do these things. I could go into the direct paths and I could see all of that stuff. And while I was doing this testing, this is a good example. This isn't the exact instance, but what I would do is I would go in there, I'd spin up a new instance, and then I would see something like this, where I couldn't get into SSM. And I for the life of me, I did not know how to fix it. But again, I did not want to bother you because, yeah, I bet you probably dealt with a lot of IAM questions. So my first thought was like, how do these two machines differ? I think that's a question you can kind of relate to a lot of different issues that developers deal with. It's like, I have something that works and something that doesn't. Tell me what the deltas between these two are, and maybe that will tell me what's missing. So what I had done, we talk about relationships between like events and data, but relationship goes deeper than that when we're talking about AWS, right? Instances, in order to be able to do that SSM action, you have to have an IAM policy. You have to have an IAM profile, an instance profile. Those are all things that are related back to the instance. And I figured if we do relationships, could I actually get in there and see that type of view? So what I did, I'm just going to run this here for us. So what you see here, Chris, that I never really talked to you about, I had actually gone through and started grouping these things together in a quick view for me instead of having to go into AWS and comb through these profiles. So in this case, we have those same two instances. We can see that they have instance profiles here, and all I've done is I've just nested this stuff. So what I do is I'd have a machine similar to this where I'd come in and I'd say, okay, well, what policies are on there right now? And in this case, we only have the elastic map reduce role. Couldn't get into terminal. So then I said, well, this machine works. What IAM policies does this system have that my current system doesn't have? And what I ended up reeling, it ends up being just this primary SSM managed instance score, but there's also this logging policies that we may want to. And because we have all of these relationships inside of Control Stack, I was able to get to a point where I could add new policies to my instance profile without ever having to bug you, and then validated they worked, and I could actually turn them into an automated script. So essentially what I did is I said, okay, well, I'll take those policies that I care about. I'm going to go in here and look at what those ARNs are directly. And then I would just go into the IAM role I cared about, and then would just assign that policy here. And once I did that, it would create events in our system that would, go to like an event timeline similar to this, where it would show me applying that policy. And then I would just do something where I would come in here and turn it into an automated script. And then at the end of it, anytime I spun up a new machine that failed on me like that, it was very easy for me just to say, go deploy this script to add those policies to that role so that I could just get in and get to this work without bugging Chris. So, I learned a few things from you along the way.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And if anyone, has done what you did in AWS console, you'll know that you started an EC2 instance. There's a little link to a instance profile. You go there, and then now you're in the world of IAM. And then, comparing it to another instance, you have to do the exact same two windows, two tabs side by side to figure out the policies. It's something that if you've done a lot, you can reason about. But the idea is a lot of this design behind Control Stack was that you can show these to the people who haven't been burned by IAM, for years and have learned the hard way. But basically make this, approachable for like the less senior technical audiences, and even the managers, the product people. That it's like the visual cues here, the layouts are all meant to really help people understand the system without having to understand IAM or get a certification from AWS or whatnot.
Yeah.
And as you showed, like you discovered that all yourself, which when I was working at IAM by myself, probably took me months to figure out and constantly snagged.
Yeah, it's Control Stack has definitely made it much easier for me to work with AWS. That's for sure. I would probably have a hard time trying to do it via console. I could do it terminal wise, but doing things via command line is just not my style. I want to be able to visually represent things and be able to see it in a much cleaner way. So Control Stack has definitely helped me there. Last thing I'll just quickly mention before we kind of wrap it up and see if there's any questions here. We talk about events and events all flowing in. Events and metrics are all here, right? I could come in here and I could look at, for example, those workloads that are flowing into our RDS instance. I can come in and see some of the dynamic dashboards that we have directly in our system, and I could compare them side by side. So if I wanted to come in here and look at those workloads, but then also see the actual RDS level data, all that stuff is directly here available for me to do it. But ultimately, as you are playing with the different systems inside of Control Stack, and we talk about filtering through these events, AWS has so many different events that it's very hard to kind of filter through that fire hose. In my case, I'm just gonna do like a simple action here. What we do at Control Stack to kind of help through some of that filtering here as well is that we'll actually go through and we'll apply banners directly on the instances and the systems that you care about. So instead of having to go through and go to Event Bridge and comb through all those events, like this is a quick way for me to say, hey, this was the problematic system. I know it based on some problematic metric that I see. What are the events tied directly to that? And then I can get right back down to like the specific stuff I care about. So yeah, Control Stack has been critical for me for understanding AWS and how we leverage it internally.
Yeah. And that's something there which I think is valuable. You know, you go from a scene of whatever infrastructure you care about, and instead of having to customize your CloudWatch logs queries or some other tool, like the events are just there in context and they let you know. So like like you don't have to go look to see if there are events. Like we give visual cues to indicate there
Right.
were events here,
We
and we
bring
can
them to
filter them
you.
and yeah, exactly.
So that's the main thing I wanted to showcase. I don't know if there's any questions on here. I think we might have Mary on the call who might be able to help us look through that. So if there are any questions, I would be happy to try to look into that.
I don't see any on my side, but if anyone wants to enter them, or reach out to us to talk one-on-one privately after this, or set up a demo actually, more specific to your use case. We are
Yes.
definitely looking for people to, um, try us out. And if this looks interesting to you, you have different use cases for infrastructure or whatnot, we'd love to talk and just, help create, get these scenes for you so that you can use it every day to make your life a little easier or, significantly easier control
Yeah.
stack. So
Yeah, absolutely. So to Chris's point, feel free to reach out to us. We try to make our emails very simple, right? It's our names at controlstack.com. So it's pretty straightforward. You can always reach out to us with questions. We certainly would love to hear from you. And if this is a product that can help, solve a pain point that you have, we want to hear about it and we want to know how we can do that. Our beta program is currently going on right now, and we just want hands on the systems that can help us validate the use cases that you're going through, the pain points you're hitting, and how we can help solve that. So if that's something of interest, please reach out to us. Otherwise, I think we can go ahead and end the webinar there. We really appreciate your time today, folks.
all right, great. And then you'll get a recording of this email or a recording of this webinar in an email. So as well, so if you want to review it or share it with people, please do.
All right, fantastic. Well, thanks again for everyone joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
I don't know how to